Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Niall Winters and I'm an Associate Professor of Learning and New Technologies with the Department of Education at the University of Oxford, where I'm also a Fellow of Keller College. What I'd like to do today is talk to you about current practices, trends and challenges in the field of technology-enhanced learning, sometimes known as e-learning, and I'm going to give an international perspective on that. So what I'm going to do is reflect on a lot of the work we've been doing in our Learning and New Technologies research group at Oxford over the past 5 or 6 years or so. I'm also going to draw on some of the work of our master's students who've been taking over the years the MSc in Education, Learning and Technology. And really this is the group you see them here this year's cohort. I'll draw on their work as well, reflect on that. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit about the process of collaboration and why it's important in the field of technology. A number of the research projects we run within the group usually have teams of about this size, 5 to 6 people. Okay, so they're not hugely large projects, but they're not too small either. So essentially this enables us to be pretty flexible, to work with usually small companies, work with local schools, and also work internationally. So this is from the Go Girl project, which is a project we have working with marginalised young women in Oxford to teach them how to use technology creatively, making a video like this, for example, and also some introductory programming skills. And that gives them the opportunity to raise their aspiration, broaden their horizons, and think about what the role technology can play in their future. So technology-enhanced learning, how do you get into it, and why is it interesting as a field? Well, I guess there are kind of 3 main routes people come from. You have people from a technical background, so maybe they've done, like myself, a computer science degree, and they're interested in technical innovation. They're interested in the role technology can play in the educational space. People then who maybe come from a research background or a teaching background who are very interested in educational theory, very interested in the role of pedagogy, for example. And thirdly, you may have people from the professional sector, so people who are professional learning designers, people who design content, who are content experts, people who are curriculum experts. Okay. And the interesting thing here is not what each person here or each group can do on their own. It's how they come together in what we would call an interdisciplinary manner. So how do they come to the center of that Venn diagram there? Right? And how do they learn from each other? And as a result of that, what kind of interesting learning technologies can be developed as a result of this rich interaction between people? So that's really what we want to think about. How do we do that? And in many cases, we're doing that, if you look at the green line on the outside there, within an educational system. Okay? That could be looking at it from a policy level, that could be looking at it from a school level, or even a classroom level. Right? There's also work we do in the informal sector, but I won't talk about that in this talk. I'll focus on the formal education system, primary, secondary, university, etc. So one of the best starting points, I think, personally, to think about technology-enhanced learning is to go back and think about the meaning of education. Okay? What type of education do we want to engage in? What kinds of students would we like to see develop in the future? Okay? And I think we wanted to develop or work with students who have very critical thinking skills. Okay? They're analytical, they're able to deal with lots of information, deal with it in an informed way. Okay? So they're not interested in rote learning, for example. They're interested in how do they build their own critical perspective on knowledge. And taking that then and applying it to the technology-enhanced learning or the TEL space, we can say we'd like to think about education with technology as the practice of freedom. i.e., what are the ways in which technology-enhanced learning supports this type of critical engagement, critical learning, analytical learning. Okay, so to do that, you're usually developing educational software or applications that are highly interactive, that enable people to collaborate, that enable them to engage in peer learning, for example. It's not simply just engaging with information, because you may as well just have a book then, right? So there has to be a good reason for why you want to work with or innovate technically, okay? And that's absolutely. So coming back then to schools and thinking a little bit more about schools, why are schools interested in technology? And I'll speak to this from a UK perspective for a moment. I think there's three things here that schools are particularly interested in, right? And for technology, one of the things that we want to be able to say is, how does it change pedagogy? Okay, how are the ways in which technology supports independent and active learning? Okay, and so the role of the teacher there is crucial, right? So how does teaching practice need to change, or how can it change when technology enters into the equation? And teachers are absolutely critical, which I'll come back to towards the middle of the talk. Teachers are absolutely critical in making that pedagogical change. There's no point trying to enforce it upon them. Okay. And a second rationale usually given for the use of technology in schools is this idea of what's termed 21st century learning. And this has a strong skills-based focus. Okay. So how can students be employment ready, if you like? What kind of skills can they develop in order to leave school or university and be ready for the 21st century jobs environment? That approach, while useful in some contexts, has also been critiqued, because if we go back to thinking about how we conceptualized or thought about education a couple of slides ago as the practice of freedom, and we want people to be critical thinkers, they need more than just skills. Skills are part of it, but it's not the whole story. Okay. And the third argument is usually what's called the logistic and economic argument. Right? So how does technology make a teacher's job more efficient? Or how can they do things in a more efficient way? How can schools become more efficient? How can they maybe have cost savings, etc.? Right? Again, as you expect, that's a relatively limited approach, because it's a limited way of thinking about education, what education should and can be. So we need to think about other ways. We need to broaden our perspective, generally, I would say, on the field on what technology can be. So and this is a nice illustration of that. On the left of your picture there, you see a TV program that was broadcast by the BBC when I was a child, that very much focused on skills, programming skills using technology, in this case a BBC Micro, which I would guess many of you watching this are probably too young to remember. But the idea was you would simply focus on coding. Okay? And you can see there, just as for point of illustration, there's two men in the photo. Right? So it was usually framed as a male-dominated activity. And in contrast to that, the work of Mar Hicks more recently has gone back and showed actually how women were absolutely critical to the development of the field. Okay, so there's a whole history here that's kind of been rediscovered about how technology relates to society. And I won't go into this too much, other than can say one of the points to consider is who is involved in technology, does it have a gender balance, and what are the ways in which women have become more involved. Okay. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is, how do we widen the base of, another way to think about it is, how do we widen the participation of people from all sorts of different backgrounds in the technology-enhanced learning field? Okay, so how we can engage in a UK university context of widening participation. So one of the examples here in Hong Kong maybe is EHLA's paper plane scheme, for for example, which I'm sure you will have heard about. Right, so this focus on overcoming inequality becomes highly, highly important. And there's a group there of young women we've been working with in Oxford on the GoGo project we'll refer to later, where we've reached out to them and brought them into a training program in Oxford to develop their technical and coding skills. And here are some of their certificates some of the group got a couple of years ago. So again, this focus of moving, so we've moved here away from just focusing on skills or just focusing on an economic argument. There's a social argument to be made as well that's becoming more and more important. So as the field is broadening, as the field is extending, what kind of opportunity does this bring? And in order to answer this question, I'm going to focus, as I said at the beginning of the talk, on some of the work we've been doing at Oxford. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge all the people there on the right-hand side of the screen who are a combination of fellow faculty at Oxford, postgraduates, PhD students and master's students. And I'll draw on a number of their research projects across 6 countries, I think it is. So we have the UK, India, the US, Peru, a number of countries in Europe and Indonesia, and finally South Africa. There's further work we're doing here in Hong Kong, but that's been covered in other videos and by other people, so I won't talk about that as much in this particular talk. So if we go back to our Venn diagram then, looking at what we're actually working on, if we think about, I said we were working in the educational system, right, so what does that actually mean? What am I going to focus on now? What part of that system? I'm going to focus on 2 things. One is the role of the teacher, because that's critically important to get the technology right in schools. And the second part is the culture of the school. Okay. What are the ways in which the school is amenable to maybe it even changes its practice around the use of technology, and how does technology become embedded in what they do? So it's not something that's just kind of parachuted in, and that may not be sustainable for that reason. It's actually become the fundamental part of what's done in schools. And this is a challenge, as we'll see. So talking a little bit about teachers now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what works in the research we've been doing, and also some of the challenges that have been faced. So this is a project I want to speak a little bit about South Africa. So this was a project, a tablet-based project that was rolled out in rural, low-income neighbourhoods across the country. And what actually worked here? Why was this program a success? And the reason it was a success is it focused on improving teachers' capabilities, right? So not only focusing on students, but focusing on training teachers to use the technology effectively, okay, to really bring it into their practice and have them almost personalize what they do. Okay, so that's really, really important. That core to the project, that ongoing training, for example, was really, really important. And in a research sense, we can say that teachers' capabilities, if we focus on the work of Amartya Sen, for example, were increased in 4 dimensions. Okay, for interested parties, they can follow up on that. I won't go into any more detail theoretically on that for this talk. Another thing that works is thinking about what basic functions can technology support and build on those. So, for example, how teachers may spend a lot of time orchestrating their classroom, organising their classroom, and what are the ways in which technologies can help with that and make their lives just that little bit easier. Then the ways in which they think about technology, the way in which they engage with it, they have a more positive, if you like, orientation towards it. So they're more likely to want to do more interesting things with the technology. So you can move then from thinking about, yes, we had a couple of easy wins around orchestration. How do we move on to pedagogical change? The more challenging aspect. An interesting note here, short story from Kinga's work, who's currently a PhD student at Oxford, talking to teachers around Oxfordshire. She asked, one teacher why they wouldn't, or what challenges they found in using technology in their practice. And the teacher said that they had some really interesting ideas. They really wanted to do some innovative stuff. This is in maths education with the technology. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to find the resources. They didn't know how to find the right software. So, for example, when they went on the App Store, a lot of the applications they found, they felt just weren't suitable for what they wanted to do. So they ended up not being able to implement their ideas. And this goes back to the point then I made earlier about actually bringing teachers in earlier. So if that teacher was brought in earlier, could they have a role in the design of the technology, for example? And how might that have changed practice down the line? Okay. So this is focusing on how do you bring teachers in as early as possible, essentially. And one of the ways Kinger found that worked actually was building learning networks for teachers. So this is essentially how teachers can learn from one another. It's used in lots of other areas of teaching, but in technology, if they have issues or they have problems or they have ideas that they'd like to implement, what are the professional networks and the ways in which that practice can be shared? So in this way, they gain new knowledge, they gain confidence, and they gain, I think, an increased ability to use technology in their own classrooms in a much more interesting way than they may be doing currently. So now I'll focus a little bit more on some of the challenges faced. And one of the ones that I spoke about, or that I touched on earlier, was about inequality. Right? And so a lot of the time technology is thought about in a very positive manner. So if you have technology in a school, if you have technology in a classroom, learning outcomes will improve, or students will sort of magically become better learners. Obviously that's not true. We really need to think about, as I talked about earlier, the pedagogical design. But one of the downsides, actually, is that if you don't think in a clear enough way about it, you can actually end up increasing inequality rather than decreasing it. So Ashna's work in India focused on two schools, one a well-resourced school and one a less resourced school. And what turned out to happen was the teachers in the well-resourced school ended up doing really quite interesting things, and so their students benefited. And because teachers in the lower income schools didn't have the same kinds of opportunities, training opportunities, the same kind of resources, but they ended up not using technology all that effectively, not really thinking about how to embed it in their practice. And so then what happened for the students in both of those schools, one group had really good opportunities to use technology and one didn't. So actually you got these differential patterns of usage with respect to technology, which ends up going in opposite directions. So that's just sort of a little warning note or a cautionary note to say you really need to think through how to use technology effectively, particularly if you're dealing with students in low income settings. One issue that's really quite interesting when it comes to thinking about technology and teaching is teacher agency. So the role teachers play in the classroom, right? And this is work focusing on the new or relatively new IT curriculum in the UK, which has a strong focus on coding. So Laura went off and she looked at schools in Oxfordshire, primary schools in Oxfordshire, and looked at how this policy was being implemented. Okay, and what was happening was that the policy, because it was relatively weakly written, ended up giving teachers a lot of scope for what they wanted to do. And where you had teachers that were effective, interested in using the technology, interested in a way to support students' programming, that worked pretty well. But where support wasn't available, or where teachers may not necessarily have the same experience, they ended up not being able to implement coding courses in an effective manner. It just became too challenging. Right? So that ended up actually having an impact on student uptake in computing and in coding, which was actually less than people expected it to be. And the logo in here, just as a side note, that's from Scratch, a programming environment developed at MIT to support particularly young people, children's programming. And Laura had done a lot of work with that too. Okay, so I've talked about the first part of the education system that I focused on, which was the role of the teacher. And now I want to move on and talk a little bit about the role of schools, and particularly the culture of the school, and how that relates to technology-enhanced learning, or the implementation of technology-enhanced learning in those schools. Okay. One really positive actually work was the work Tracy had done in the US, thinking about what happens when technology is really integrated into a school. Right? And so she looked at schools in the US where the culture within the school really focused on the role of technology. Okay, so how it could be used across the curriculum, how it could be used in different classes. And actually, because it was so embedded, students needed to engage in the technology in a very productive way in order, if you like, to fully integrate them into the educational opportunities within the school. Right? So if they didn't have the technical skills coming in, they would get help and support to do that. But actually, the core of the culture of the school was very much around technology as a key part of what we do. So the whole of our educational process, the whole of our educational experience was built around that. So this is a very nice example of what happens when people really spend time thinking about the role of technology in the school. I wanted to contrast that with the work of James Robson, who's been working on with UK schools for the last number of years. And this happened in the context of UK government spending a lot of money on technology in schools. It was up to around or just above £900 million sterling in 2016. Right? And what he found, looking across a number of schools, is that implementation of technology in schools was haphazard, essentially. Right? So certain schools were quite good, certain schools were weaker. Development was not systematic. Things happened sort of incrementally and often depended on particular teachers. So if that teacher left, the school actually wasn't developing their use of technology in the way they would have been if that teacher had stayed. Right? So this overt focus on particular interested individuals, interested teachers, meant that actually the school culture itself didn't change that much. Right? And what ended up happening then is they ended up investing a lot of money in technology that after a few years was just abandoned. Right? And so it's a cycle of, why would I begin to use technology in my teaching or in my school if it's just going to be left there after a few years? Right? So that kind of way of saying we won't put technology into our schools in the same manner ends up happening. And so to try and avoid this practice, James suggests that our schools need to develop what he calls holistic digital strategies, right, that analyze the needs of the school as a whole, not just individual teachers, but also brings in administration, also brings in social policy, so issues around the use of social media might be one current example, and critically the pedagogical need. All of these things need to be addressed within the school culture if technology is to be embedded within it. I'll go on now to speak about a project in Peru, which from the outset looks like a very interesting project. Right, so it's schools in Peru called the Innova Schools, an Innova school chain, right, which is an award-winning private school chain, okay, who focus on a lot of the good things I've been talking about. So collaboration, peer learning, the teacher as a guide on the side, if you like, in that phrase, for supporting student learning. Okay. And he looked at actually what was actually happening in the school, what's actually going on here. And what he found is that actually within the school, the collaborative use, let's say, or the interactive use was actually highly structured. So teachers had lost agency or lost freedom over what they could do and how they could use technology. Right? So even their classroom sessions were pre-scripted, were downloaded from their online platform, and teachers simply implemented them. So they became, if you like, and this is my perspective, came a little bit more like a cog in the machine, if you like, rather than actually having true agency around what they're doing. Right? And then it turns out in the collaborative group work, where you would think students would be rewarded for working with each other, working collaboratively, working in teams, all this good thing. It actually turns out that they were much more supported for working individually. So they weren't truly engaging in computer-supported collaborative learning as they should have been. And this is interesting because you see from the photos here, there's actually quite a lot of money gone into these schools. They're very nice buildings. They're often in areas, as you see from the bottom left there, of relatively high deprivation. And so it's a big push. It's a big input. But actually, fundamentally, pedagogy doesn't seem to be changing that much. So we need to keep these things in mind. Popping back again to the UK, Professor Chris Davies' work on this, what kind of perspective generally can we say schools in the UK are taking, or at least in England from his work? And actually, he would say that it's still pretty much still largely conservative, still pretty cautious, right? So not really affecting massive change in pedagogy, right? And so an important point, for example, let's take the point of computational thinking and how can technology support students to think in that way. He actually found that there was no real evidence showing that the curriculum had changed in any way to respond to this, right? And so there was no new, what might be called digital literacies gained within the system, okay? And so when you actually go out and look for real-world innovative practice in many UK schools, it's simply not there yet. And as I say, this is in the context of pumping in hundreds of millions of pounds into schools. So kind of more needs to be done, really. Still, I think, an overt focus on the technology itself, rather than on the interplay, if you remember that Venn diagram I showed at the beginning, the interplay between those circles. So now, having talked about teachers and schools, I'm just going to drill into one area that's topical at the moment, which is the role of artificial intelligence in education. I'm going to talk a little bit of the work I've been doing with Ken Khan on students' perception, particularly young students' perception of artificial intelligence. And so in Laura's work I talked about in the UK, a focus on learning programming and programming skills and learning using Scratch to do that. And what Ken has been working on is thinking about how Scratch, or Snap, which is a version of Scratch, how Snap can be used to support young students to think through concepts in AI. So can you program, for example, a facial recognition system, right? So use an AI technology to recognize the pattern in someone's face and say maybe they're happy, they're sad. And how we've done this is, you can see the code on the screen there, very short, a few lines of code. You can link this, long story short, you can link this to cloud-based AI services and look at the ways in which you can use their libraries, their AI as a service, and students can program it to do interesting things. So to program a robot to navigate around a room, for example. Right? And what this does is it shows students the power of AI, so where it's going, so they can begin to ask questions about how should it be used, when should it be used, is it a force for good, what might be some of the issues that arise from it, through this construction of their own AI-supported projects. Okay, and that's actually been really interesting work over the past few years. This is work from Renee and Edumova, which is in Greece, company in Greece as part of a European project we're involved in at Oxford, which is focusing on developing teacher skills in both AI, but also in the maker movement. So making tangible tools for students, right? And teachers, a training program for them to use these very innovative technologies, Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, AI services, robotics. And this is pilot work that's going on in Greece, understanding the role teachers play, or how teachers can be trained and upskilled to engage with these technologies in an appropriate manner. And what Renee's work is beginning to show is the process by which this happens. Right? And what's really interesting, what comes up again, is that when teachers have proper pedagogical and technical support, right? So again, you can't just parachute this new technology into people or into classrooms. And they do a pretty good job, but that training and that extra support needs to be there, right? And may be different depending on the teacher themselves. Some teachers may obviously need more help, and other teachers may need more help than others. And really positive outcome was, even if teachers were a little bit standoffish at the beginning, involving them in co-learning, in co-design, as shown in some of the photos there earlier, actually brings them into the fold, right? And again, helps them engage in peer learning, right? So peer learning doesn't just happen online, it just happens face-to-face. It happens through doing, right? And through this doing, they can develop educational resources, they can develop activities that can then be shared with others. So it begins to build up a community, going back to what Kinga was saying about a network of teachers, a network of learning for teachers. And this is one way of practically doing that. Right? And so there's a lot of resources that have been developed around this that I can share. And in this last phase, I'm going to end by focusing a little bit on the future. Where do we think we're going? Following up on the AI example, the artificial intelligence example I just gave, I think we have to be aware that there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment. Right? There's a lot of claims been made about what it can possibly do that actually it doesn't live up to. Right? So just be a little bit wary when you hear about job losses, etc., due to AI. I don't think is going to happen in the teaching space. What is going to happen is that artificial intelligence may augment the practice of the pedagogical practice of teachers. So, for example, in a project called MyGen we had a few years ago, the AI system was able to recommend how students in a classroom could be paired together. So you might want to pair, for example, a quite an able student with one that's having a few problems and see how they can help each other. Right? And so the system can recommend those kind of pairings to the teacher, and the teacher can decide, actually, yes, that's a good idea, I would like to pair those students together. And thinking in the short term, in sort of 2 to 3 years, as ed tech or that term becomes bigger, there's an increasing need, again, just going back to what I said at the beginning, to involve teachers as early as possible in the conversation. So how do they become central to the development of technology-enhanced learning, particularly as the commercial side of things becomes bigger and bigger? So I'll move on to the next slide then, which is more about the future, but this time the future in schools. And this is going to always, I think, be a complex picture, right? So thinking about technology in schools is not easy. It's always going to be messy, it's always going to be contested, people will have different views, and I don't want to say it's always going to be unequal, but you do need to actually make a serious effort to address inequalities earlier, or they're going to continue to increase if we're not careful. And I think that's particularly true, not always, but as the field becomes more commercialized, at least in the UK and certainly in the US and perhaps Australian context as well, the role the market plays in education, and particularly the role of technology in education, will become more important. So we need to find ways in which academia, schools, the public sector, the commercial sector can work together in positive ways. Within schools then, I think there needs to be a conversation, an ongoing conversation about how schools respond to the use of technology, how they actually think about both the technical, the social, and the pedagogical aspects of what could change within the school itself. And that conversation needs to be transparent, it needs to be open, and it needs to involve everyone. So not just teachers or senior leaders, but you also involve, I think, definitely students in that, definitely parents and caregivers in that, but also ed tech companies as well, for example, academics, educational researchers, perhaps I think have a role to play there. So that dialogue needs to happen, and I don't think it's happening in certain pockets at the moment, but I think there needs to be a broader conversation to occur or to happen. I just want to end here by thanking everyone again for their input. Chris, Laura, Kinga, James, Ashna, Tracy, Alberto, Ken, Renee, Lawrence, Eric, of course, and Morrison, and the team here at EHLA, and also Penjing and Mira. So thanks to everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this talk, this introduction to an international perspective